Hey there, my name is Alex. I am the Silver Mont, and this video is designed to be an introduction to healing in Final Fantasy XIV, a quick starter guide, just as some players will experience tankxiety, so too will some feel potentially overwhelmed at the prospect of being responsible for keeping the group alive as a healer. Hopefully this video will help convince you that there's really nothing to worry about there, as well as giving you an intro to healing, and maybe even helping you decide which healer you'd like to play the most of the 4 currently available at time of writing. On that note, even if you're not planning to ever tank, I would still suggest also checking out my video on tanking, because it's good to know the tools that your tanks will be working with, after all. But let's kick things off with a quick overview of each healer in Final Fantasy XIV. Keep in mind, right now we have 4, but if you're watching this in the future, then I'm afraid I won't be covering, I don't know, Chemist, or Time Mage, or Vaccine Master in this video. Right now we have 4 healers, loosely categorized as regen healers or barrier or shield healers. White Mage and Astrologian are regen healers, Scholar and Sage, barrier healers. Prior to the introduction of Sage, White Mages were regen, Scholars were barrier, and Astrologian had 2 stances, allowing them to sub for either role. White Mage is the classic healer. They draw their energy from nature and the elements, primarily earth, wind, and water. You'll be casting spells such as Holy and Regen and have some rather flashy damage abilities, although I'll confess it's my least favourite healer. The animations just look kinda strange on my character. And if you're going to be looking at these animations thousands of times, good to have ones that you like. Scholars summon fairies to assist them in combat and have a flavour reminiscent of battlefield tacticians. You can also clobber people with your book, which is absolutely absurd, in a good way. Personally, I consider this the easiest healer, but that might also be as it's the one I've played the most, the one I started with, but it does have a very simple kit for most levels of play. Astrologians were the first healer added to the game after launch. You won't be able to start the game playing as one. Whilst White Mage starts as Conjurer and Scholars start as Arcanists, the Astrologian has no corresponding class, and you'll need to reach Ishgard in the main scenario quest before you can start playing as one. They divine their strength from the reading of fate, stars, tarot cards, and whatnot. I consider them the most complex healer. Finally, we have Sage, the most recent healer, added in Endwalker, and my favourite because it has laser beams. Whilst I think it's marginally harder than Scholar, I think it's an incredibly powerful healer with tools for every situation thereabouts. And despite being classified more as a barrier healer, it still has some very impressive regen too. As with Astrologian, you can't start as a Sage. You need to have purchased Endwalker and also have reached level 70. The quest to unlock it is in Limsa Lominsa. Picked a favourite yet? Or indeed, you can always play all of them. But well, let's go over some of the basics of healing. Whilst the names are different, you'll find that the healers all share some very common tools. First up, your damage abilities, as that's the easiest thing to go over. Keep in mind that whilst you don't need to use your damage abilities, it will generally be expected of you to throw them out to help clear encounters faster. Don't worry though, each healer has a very simple DPS rotation. All of the healers will have a basic damage spell, as well as a damage over time that lasts around 30 seconds. So your general damage rotation is just make sure you have the damage over time, which is instant cast, ticking on the enemy, and then just spam your main damage spell when you're not healing. Of course, healing is your priority. Damage is what you do in downtime, when things are going smoothly and nobody needs healing. Other than those 2 spells, each of the healers may have their more specialised damage abilities which might work in tandem with certain resources. Take the White Mage for example. At higher levels, the White Mage will have a Blood Lily meter. Each time you use certain spells, it will fill up the meter. Once the meter is full, you can use a powerful instant cast attack. How about healing? Every healer has a basic healing ability you can cast, which will usually take about a second or 2 to get off. But at higher levels, this is actually something you won't use that much. The regen, aka heals that remain on the target and tick gradually over time, are generally more useful. Let's use White Mage again as an example. You can put a regen on the tank, then push out some damage. You don't need to stand around and wait for him to lose health so that you can cast Cure or Cure 2. It's also worth pointing out that, for the most part, health is actually a binary system. A tank might have only 5,000 health left, or they could have 50,000 left, or any percentage between 1 and 100%. But at the end of the day, the only hit point that matters is the last one. That's where experience will come into play. So long as your tank is above a certain threshold of health, they will be able to survive attacks. So your job is to keep them above that threshold. Are they at 100% with a Tank Buster, an aptly named super powerful attack that will chunk their health and probably outright kill any non-tank player it hits? Well, they'll survive it at 100%. But if they're at 20% and there's a Tank Buster coming, then they're gonna need a heal. Every healer has instant cast heals, including some which are off the global cooldown. The global cooldown being something that happens between most actions, but not all of them. For example, although White Mage's regen is instant cast, it still triggers the global cooldown of, by default, 2.5 seconds, meaning you need to wait 2.5 seconds before you can cast another spell, whereas Tetragrammaton is instant cast and off the global cooldown, meaning that in theory you could cast it instantly twice in a row with no wait, if it didn't have its own internal cooldown. But you could go from Tetragrammaton to regen, or you could cast regen then Tetragrammaton, and so on. Managing your instant off-global cooldown OGCDs, as they are known, is perhaps the most important part of healing, and briefly, semi-related, we'll touch on a rather specific White Mage exclusive topic, Cure versus Cure 2. Generally speaking, it is advisable to use Cure 2 over Cure 1, or just Cure. Even if that seems to slightly go against what the game seems to want you to do with the whole, oh, Cure has a chance to proc 3 Cure 2s. But what it boils down to is, at higher levels, if you are casting a Cure spell at all, it should probably be 2, because you're getting almost double the healing potency for the same amount of global cooldown. Beyond your single target spells, you also have area of effect spells. Many abilities in Final Fantasy XIV will hit the entire party, no matter where they're standing, whereas your AoE heals to top people back up, well, they will often be centered around your character, meaning that you need to try and position yourself in such a way that your spell reaches all players, or as many as it can. As with your single targets, you'll have both instant and cast time area of effect abilities. Of course, the instants or OGCDs are generally preferable, as it allows you to keep up your barrage of damage spells on the enemy. Finally, we have revives. All healers have a revive spell, which function almost identically, along with summoners and red mages. These spells take a long time to cast and cost a lot of MP, but they can be combined with Swift Cast, a roll action that all healers have, to make it instant, which is very useful. You'll generally want to combine those two actions. That's probably the best use you're going to get out of Swift Cast as a healer. You can use it for damage, but probably safer not to unless you are confident nobody's going to die. You might even want to create a macro for Swift Cast and Revive. Personally, I use this on-screen macro, but if you're more diehard about healing, you can of course look up other superior ones. This is just a basic one I made to use. Speaking of revives, the healer's limit break. Despite visual differences between the 4 healers, all of their limit breaks function the exact same way. Limit breaks have 3 levels. There are almost no situations where you would ever want to use a healer's level 1 or level 2 limit break, just don't bother. With level 3, only when things are going poorly. That said, the healer's level 3 limit break is an absolute game changer. It will instantly revive and full heal everyone in the group. The range is a lot greater than most other abilities, making it hard to miss with it. When to use it? Well, of course you need to judge that for yourself. Generally speaking, I would say start thinking about it if 4 players are down. You don't necessarily need to do it with 4 players down, but be ready and have it in mind in case things go further south. This is in an 8-man group, of course. If you have 4 people down in a 4-person group, then, well, that's unfortunate. And obviously, if you ever run into a situation where it's like just you, or you and a tank, or you and the other healer, don't even hesitate to limit break. It all depends on what's coming next though. If you have time to recover slowly and get everyone back up, then you can save the limit break. But if things are too chaotic, just go ahead and blast it out. I'd say if you have doubts, err on the side of caution and just use it. People would rather not have a melee limit break than wipe, I would say. Remember, hesitation is defeat. So, generally speaking, you're going to have two types of content in 14 as a healer. 4-man dungeons and 8-man trials. Of course, there's also things like 24-man alliance raids, PvP and so on. We won't be touching much on PvP in this video as that's a very different beast. Likewise, we won't be touching on the very high-end content, Ultimate, Savage, etc. Let's cover dungeons first. For the most part, dungeons will be done in large pools. This won't always be the case, and at lower levels especially, this can be rather dangerous because you're not really going to have the tools to keep the tank alive, necessarily. It won't always be the case that these pools will be huge either. As a healer, you can always ask your tank for smaller pools, or indeed the tank himself might be new and not want to do big pools. Most of the time, in dungeons level 50 or higher though, people will be pulling wall to wall, which means they will gather every single group of monsters before a boss. So most dungeons will come down to 3 big pools and 3 bosses. The responsibilities here are split between all members of the group. The tank needs to keep all of the enemies on them using AoE abilities, whilst also using their mitigation to enhance their defenses and not die. The DPS need to kill things in a timely fashion. You as the healer need to make sure the tank survives. If the tank melts, there's a very good chance everyone else will follow moments later. In these large pools you won't have much time for dealing damage, but you might be able to get off some AoE here and there. You'll also want to keep an eye on the tank's health and make sure that your instants are ready to top them off. Keep your regen or your barriers on the tank, and it never hurts to recognise a tank's invincible button. For example, a paladin might pop Hallowed Ground on the first big pull of a dungeon, which renders them invincible for 10 seconds, which means you are free to do your damage. I mean, if you're playing White Mage, you might want to save your Holy, which stuns enemies until after Hallowed Ground wears off. Whereas a Gunbreaker's works roughly the same way, with the only small difference being that they will also be reduced to 1 hit point, making White Mage's Benediction useful. Just hope you use it after Super Belied, and not before. The exact combos you need to use to keep people alive will differ per class. Scholar, for example, will pop Excogitation on the tank, although honestly Scholar should always have Excogitation on the tank because Excogitation is amazingly good. It is a buff that will automatically heal the tank once they drop below a certain percentage of health. Or take the Sage, who has perhaps one of the best kits for these big dungeon pools. You can hit the tank with Krasis, which is a buff that lasts 10 seconds and increases all of their health regen by 20%. So every healing you put on them is 20% better, basically. Then follow that up with Kerachol and Physis 2 to stick on 2 regens that stack and are also being buffed by Krasis. Finally, Popperheimer or Panheimer, which will put on a very powerful set of shields. Then you can just dish out some damage, which will also heal the tank, thanks to Cardia. And if they start dropping down, you have a bunch of instant casts, such as Drucol and Toracol, the latter of which also reduces damage taken by the target. Those Sage spell names are something, aren't they? But that's generally how you'll work it for each healer, just with different spells. You put on regen or shields, then you spam your AoE. If the tank goes below, I don't know, 70 or 60%, then you might want to toss an instant OGCD at them. In 8-man content, you'll generally have a lot more time to deal damage, as there won't be as many wall-to-wall pulls. And you have another healer helping you out. And 2 tanks, too. Most of the time, you'll be alright just to put your regen and barriers on the tank and just use a damage spell. But you're going to need to watch out for raid wides, tank busters and so on, that, well, you're going to need to top people off after, along with the potential for, say, bards and machinists, just as an example, who are dancing out on the very edge of the arena, miles away from everyone else, and, more importantly, out of your AoE range, so you'll need to top off individuals a lot more. Keep in mind that if, for example, your Dragoon takes a hit and loses some health, you might not need to top him off right away, unless you know there's another big hit incoming. Every DPS has ways to regenerate their own health, a burst and a slower health regen on hit style effect. But of course they do have cooldowns. You don't need to keep track of that. You can just top them off happily, but if you see Bloodbath on a DPS and you know there's no imminent danger, you can just let them recover by themselves. It's good to be aware of, but it's not crucial by any means. Your priority should always be keeping the tank and healers alive. If both healers go down and there's no summoners or red mages, well, things can spiral downward quickly there. It's also worth pointing out, if you revive someone, remember that they're going to be largely defenseless after that revive, as they're going to have like no health. So you might need to toss a heal or two their way to avoid them getting flattened instantly by a raid wide or some other ability coming in. Generally speaking, Alliance raid content follows much of the same style of 8-man trials, with the main difference being that you'll only have one tank in your party, 3 tanks total, 1 for each alliance. Oh, and as for like normal raids, those are for the most part the same as 8-man trials. But in alliances, you may need to help out the other alliances, the other parties. Whilst you can target and heal them, they won't be hit by most of your AoEs. The main thing to watch out for in alliance content is if both healers of another alliance go down, you're going to need to step in and bring one up. And if the main tank isn't in your party, you can generally let their party take care of the healing, but you might need to throw a heal now and then, and many alliance raids will have specific attacks that hit all 3 tanks. By and large though, if everyone knows the content, alliance raids are honestly some of the smoothest sailing for healers, because there's so many of you. The main difficulty in healing, in my opinion, comes from multitasking, damaging, healing, and avoiding mechanics. If you're struggling with this in any way, well then focus on keeping yourself alive first and foremost, then on healing. It's okay to lose out on some damage if you need more time to focus on avoiding mechanics, and it's very easy, at least for me, to run into a situation where you're focused on bringing someone back to life and then you get hit by something in the process, maybe even dying yourself. In those situations, it can honestly just be better to wait for some relative safety before attempting to help a down player. You don't always need to rush to get someone up. There's a very useful feature in the game's user interface called focusing targets. This allows you to, say, focus a tank and keep their bar in a spot of your choosing on the screen. You'll see that in most of these examples I focus the main tank as the healer, then I keep my target on the boss most of the time, only swapping to the tank momentarily to dunk a heal on their head. But you might also prefer to focus the boss. See, either way, when you are looking at a boss, you'll be able to see what they are casting. This will help you keep ahead of what to expect, raid wides, tank busters, and so on, and let you manage the mechanics. You might also enjoy customizing your UI, be it moving the party interface to the center of the screen or wherever you want it, or readjusting the position of the party members. By default, F1, F2, F3 and so on will target the first 2-3 members of the party, which can be a nice shortcut to get a quick OGCV out on someone who needs it. Unfortunately, I have no experience playing on controller, so I have no real advice for optimal target management on controller. As for actual content, like fights and stuff, remember that positioning is important, not only to avoid mechanics, but to ensure your AoEs hit as many people as you can. Generally speaking, standing in the center is a good idea for healers, and of course make sure you aren't standing next to the tank, as they will typically be facing the enemies away from the group, and being in their proximity could mean you get bifurcated, courtesy of a tank buster. Your first instinct, if you're new to healing, might be to stand as far away from the enemy and other people as you can, but honestly, standing relatively close to the enemy, somewhere between the melee and the ranged DPS, might be the better option, especially as many of your healer AoE abilities are centered on you. Just remember to waddle away from enemy AoEs and other mechanics. On the topic of positioning, rescue, that most contentious of spells, what's it do? Drags a target party member over to you. However, due to the unique way 14 is designed, this spell is very dangerous. Others might well disagree, but I'm going to tell you right now that there's almost never a time where you'd want to use rescue. Even when used correctly, it often vexes other players to suddenly be yanked violently with no say in the matter. Sure, you can use it to annoy your friends at the end of a fight by zipping them into your face, but with random or unknown players, like most of your interactions with the other players in the game, it's generally better to just never use rescue, no matter how tempting. Of course, there are situations where you can use it to save a life. There's a level 50 Alliance raid, for example. The Labyrinth of the Ancients, the final boss, Phlagathon, has a flare attack, which requires you to stand on buttons on the edge of the arena. As a healer, you're likely going to reach that button before the melee DPS, who might have a bit of a distance to cover. If you see someone in your party isn't going to make it in time and they're running there, you might be okay whipping out rescue in that situation. But there's very few instances in the game where you're going to want to use it. A lot of the time you might just confuse someone or drag them into another AoE or possibly have them hurl themselves off a ledge by mistake. So if there's one ability to remove from your hotbars, it'd probably be rescue. Again, it does have its uses, but it annoys many players and some consider it griefing even to be rescued, so be careful hitting that big yellow button. However, that is most of the important stuff covered. Healing can be the smoothest way to play 14, as your damage rotations are so low key. If I don't want to be dealing with the 50 million actions per minute required from, I don't know, my ninja or whatever, sometimes it's nice to just hop on Scholar and womp out one button over and over again, you know? But the most important thing of all for healers, communication. If you don't know a fight, or you have questions or doubts or anything like that, let people know. Hey, I'm new to this dungeon, please take it slow or let me know of any important mechanics. Whilst it might be very tempting to blame people for dying, remember that everyone makes mistakes, and other players might not be as skilled as you are, or they're just having a bad day, or their cat jumped on their keyboard, who knows? And likewise, be ready to take abuse. If someone dies, their first instinct, 9 out of 10 times, is to blame the healer, even if there was absolutely nothing you could do. Best case scenario, if someone is blaming you, flaming you, ignore it. If it becomes a big problem, they move on to griefing, like intentionally dying or being AFK or whatever. Just go with a vote kick. Or leave yourself if that's not an option. It's rarely a good idea to try and argue things out, because nobody ever wants to admit they are wrong. Nobody wants to be told, oh, don't stand in the fire. Oh, I want to stand in the fire, you don't pay my sub, I'm going to stand in all the fires I want to. From my experience running however many hundreds of dungeons, thousands of dungeons over the years, people will always want to blame the healer. Don't let it get to you. And hey, if it actually was your fault, well, just give them a my bad. We all make mistakes after all. So I hope this video helped in some way. If you were curious or perhaps even intimidated by the idea of healing. If I had to rank the healers in terms of strength, well, for me it's Sage, Scholar, White Mage, Astrologian. If I had to rank them in terms of ease of use, Scholar, White Mage, Sage, Astrologian. Ranking in coolness, Sage, Astrologian, Scholar, White Mage. Entirely subjective, of course. I find Astrologian more complex and busy than the others, but it's not like super hard or anything. It's just more complex. But don't let that scare you off if you love the look of it. Give it a spin, see how it goes. Oh, and remember that getting White Mage also gets you a unicorn mount, if that's your thing. Until next time, thank you so much for watching and take care. I have a lot of other Final Fantasy XIV guide videos up on the channel, so check them out if you're curious about other aspects of the game. Likewise, if I haven't covered something and you're curious about it, please do ask in the comments and I'll answer ASAP, or if it warrants it, I'll make a video on the subject. Till then, ciao.